What happens when your dignity is questioned in the most public, humiliating way, just for sitting in the seat you paid for? Imagine being a brilliant, composed black woman CEO, standing calm and unshaken at the gate of a major airport, only to be denied your rightful first-class seat because of your skin color. This isn't just a story about an airline dispute. It's a profound journey into power, identity, and resilience. Who holds the real authority when a gate agent, a smug passenger, and even security try to rewrite your story? What happens when the very person they try to humiliate turns out to be the owner of the airline itself? How far does the ripple of one moment of bias extend? Is justice swift? Or does it require a revolution from within? And when the stakes are higher than just a seat, when it's about systemic change, how do you wield power without losing your humanity? Set against the tense, enclosed world of a transatlantic flight and the towering boardrooms of corporate America. This story will challenge what you think about privilege, prejudice, and perseverance. Ready to witness how one woman's quiet strength topples old systems and rewrites the rules, hit like, share, and subscribe to join us on this powerful journey of justice served at 35,000 feet. The air in JFK's Terminal 8 always carried a faint perfume of tension, a blend of fresh jet fuel, overpriced espresso, and 1,000 unspoken conversations hummed through the hall like electricity under tile. For most, it was chaos. For Avery Miles, it was routine, controlled, strategic. She moved through the terminal like a symphony played in a minor key, graceful, composed, and alert, dressed in a long ivory coat over a sharply cut charcoal pantsuit. Avery walked with her phone in one hand and a slim leather folio in the other. Her black hair was pulled back into a sleek knot. Her heels clicked with soft precision. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. She had SOUT 2A in first class on Solis Air Flight 802 to Paris. She had earned it. Her mind buzzed with numbers and boardroom names as she scanned the monitors and adjusted course for Gate 17. Horizon Equity, her private equity firm, had just secured a final stage merger with Lunatech Aeronautics, a legacy European aerospace tech company. The next day, she would meet Solis Air's board of directors for formal integration talks. It was a meeting over 2 years in the making, and she was the architect. Avery had spent her life being underestimated. That was no longer a surprise, but it still stung, sometimes more than she cared to admit. Her rise hadn't been handed to her. It had been wrestled from places where people didn't believe black girls could speak the language of capital markets or build billion-dollar funds, where leadership had a face and her face didn't match it. She'd let the data do the talking. She always had. At the gate, the line for first class was nearly empty. A few well-dressed passengers milled around, sipping bottled water and checking their watches. A large man in a gray cashmere blazer glanced at her and then away quickly, as if her presence in the priority lane didn't compute. Avery stepped forward and offered her phone to the gate agent, who didn't take it right away. The woman behind the counter had thinning blonde hair cut into a severe bob. Her name tag read Linda Brewster. Linda didn't greet her. She didn't smile. Instead, she tilted her head with a frown and said, "I think you might be in the wrong line." Avery blinked once. "This is Solis 802 to Paris." Linda nodded stiffly. "First class, seat 2A," Avery said, calmly offering her boarding pass again. Linda finally took the phone, squinting at the screen. Her eyes narrowed further. Her fingers moved with slow deliberation over her keyboard. The silence stretched long enough to become intentional. Then came the voice flat, disingenuously polite. I'm seeing a conflict here. It looks like there's a double booking for this seat." Avery's face remained neutral, but her pulse ticked higher. "There shouldn't be," she said. "It was confirmed last night. Paid through my corporate account." Linda's lips pursed. "These things happen. The system autocorrects based on availability. But don't worry, we've got a seat in premium economy, seat 26B, middle seat, but it has extra leg room." She printed the new boarding pass and slid it across the counter without looking up. Avery didn't move to take it. Instead, she inhaled slowly. She remembered her training. She remembered her mission. She remembered every moment and every meeting where she'd been called too aggressive for defending basic facts. "Respectfully," she said, her voice low and steady. "That seat was not available when I booked. I paid for first class. I need that seat. I have work to complete before a critical meeting." Linda's fingers hovered over the keyboard again, tapping, but not for any real reason. "Ma'am," she said. The word landed sharp, as if it were an insult. "There's nothing I can do. The cabin is full. This is the only seat I can offer you." Behind Avery, someone huffed loudly. "For God's sake," came a voice, "just take the seat and stop holding up the line." Avery turned slightly. The man was tall, with slicked back hair and a coral pink polo stretched too tightly over his stomach. A monogrammed duffel bag hung from his shoulder. His expression was a cocktail of impatience and superiority. Linda glanced at him with something close to camaraderie, then back at Avery with renewed authority. Avery did not speak, not yet. Her mind was already working ahead, calculating options, costs, optics. She knew this game. She'd seen it before in conference rooms with gleaming floors and frosted glass, in strategy meetings where her ideas were echoed by men 5 minutes later and finally applauded. The difference was, she had spent 2 decades preparing for it. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," Avery said, gently but clearly. Linda's face hardened. "I'm the senior agent on duty," she said, "and if you're not going aboard, I'll need you to step aside for the other passengers." Avery pulled out her phone. She tapped her screen and quietly, discreetly, began recording. She panned across the gate, then back to Linda, capturing the name tag and the boarding pass still resting untouched on the counter. "Could I get your full name?" Avery asked. Linda's mouth tightened. "I don't have to give you that," she snapped. "Now, either you take the seat or I will call security." Avery stared at her, not with anger, not with fear, but with the quiet, searing recognition that this moment, this exact moment, was the reason her work existed. She texted a single line to her chief counsel denied seat. "Gate 17. Solis 802. Start protocol." Behind her. Pink Polo muttered something under his breath that sounded like entitled. Avery didn't respond. She simply stepped back and waited, because there was a difference between silence and surrender, and Avery Miles had never surrendered a day in her life. Avery stood still, feet planted, as the boarding line moved around her like water around a rock. People passed her with glances that ranged from impatient to indifferent. She didn't move, didn't raise her voice. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. And beneath that stillness, her pulse beat like a war drum. She glanced again at the boarding pass for seat 2A on her phone. There was no mistake. She had booked it weeks ago, confirmed it twice. Her Horizon Equity travel coordinator had called Solis Air directly to ensure that nothing about this flight would be left to chance. That seat was hers, but Linda Brewster had decided otherwise. Behind the counter, Linda kept pretending to type, the clack of her keys sounding more like a metronome of authority than an actual attempt to help. Every motion screamed performance. She wasn't searching for solutions, she was asserting control. Avery had seen that type before. People who wore their thin sliver of power like a crown and wielded it like a weapon, especially when they thought no one would notice, especially against people who looked like her. Behind her, Graham Dalton had resumed his muttering. She could hear him clearly. She's trying to pull something. Bet she bought a cheap ticket and thought she could hustle her way up front. Avery breathed in slowly. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. His voice was loud enough to make sure everyone heard it. That was the point. He wanted her to feel ashamed, smaller, out of place, and worst of all, he thought he had the right. Linda seemed to grow more confident with each one of his barbs. She crossed her arms now, leaning slightly on the counter. "Ma'am, the seat is no longer available. I'm trying to help you. If you don't want seat 26B, that's your choice, but the flight is closing soon." Avery looked her directly in the eyes. "This isn't help," she said, voice quiet but firm. "This is erasure." Linda blinked. "Excuse me, I didn't lose my seat. Someone took it." For a flicker of a second, something flashed in Linda's face. Guilt recognition. Or maybe just surprise that Avery had dared to speak with clarity. But then it hardened again. "Passengers get reassigned every day," she said coldly. "And how often do those passengers look like me?" Avery asked. That was the moment Linda picked up the phone. "Security, please, gate 17. I have a passenger refusing to comply with boarding instructions. Refusing to comply." Avery closed her eyes briefly. She felt her breath catch in her throat and then release in a slow, deliberate stream. She'd heard those words before. They were the prelude to escalation, to being dragged, filmed, misunderstood, to being made into a problem when all she wanted was fairness. She looked down at her phone and pressed send. Her legal team was now watching the live stream. Avery wasn't alone anymore. 2 Port Authority officers arrived within minutes. One was older, maybe late 40s, with a mustache and eyes that had seen too many terminals and too few peaceful endings. The other was younger, wiry, a little too eager. Linda immediately launched into her story. She became confrontational. I explained the seat was reassigned and she started filming me without consent. I offered her an alternative and she refused to board. The younger officer looked ready to act. His hand hovered near his belt, not threatening exactly, but signaling authority. The older one held up a hand and turned to Avery. "Ma'am, can I get your side?" Avery nodded. She held out her phone and boarding pass. "My name is Avery Miles. I'm a ticketed first-class passenger for seat 2A on Solis Air 802 to Paris. I arrived early, followed all procedures, and was told my seat had been reassigned without explanation. When I asked to speak to a supervisor, Ms. Brewster refused and called security instead. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't speak fast. Her words were deliberate and laced with practiced restraint. The older officer took the phone, looked at the boarding pass. He checked the timestamp. He looked back at Avery. "You have any idea why they'd move you?" he asked. Softer now. "No," she said, "but I have suspicions." He nodded, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging her calm. The younger officer glanced at Linda. "Can you show us the manifest?" Linda hesitated. This is internal. I followed protocol. You're saying the system moved her automatically?" Linda stiffened. "Yes, that's what the screen showed." The officer raised an eyebrow. "And who's in seat 2A now?" Another beat. Linda didn't answer. The older officer looked at Avery again. "Ma'am, are you recording this?" "I am," she said. "Good. Keep doing that." That surprised her. She nodded. Graham stepped forward then, interjecting with the boldness of someone used to being heard. "Why are we even entertaining this? She's making a scene. She's just trying to get something for free." The younger officer turned to him. "Sir, step back, but step back." The authority in his voice was enough this time. Avery finally turned and looked at Graham. Her gaze wasn't angry. It was precise. "I paid for my seat. I have every right to be here. What do you have?" He didn't answer. The older officer turned back to Linda. "Ma'am, we need the name of the passenger in 2A. Now." Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. Her fingers moved reluctantly on the keyboard. Avery stepped closer, just enough to see the monitor. The name that popped up next to seat 2A was familiar, not in a personal way, but in a strategic one. Victor Harlan, CEO of Solis Air. She almost laughed. Of course it was him. She took a deep breath. The tension she had been holding settled into something calmer. Not ease, but clarity. This was no longer just a gate dispute. This was a test, not just of her composure, but of the system. She looked at the officers. "I suggest you don't make any further moves," she said softly. "There's going to be a correction." And then, from inside the jet bridge, the sound of firm footsteps echoed louder than the boarding announcements. Victor Harlan was coming. The click of dress shoes on the jet bridge floor cut through the tension like a scalpel. Clean, sharp, deliberate. Victor Harlan stepped into view, and the space around the gate seemed to shift. The chatter died instantly. Even the overhead announcements faded into the background, like they were waiting for him to speak. He moved with the ease of a man accustomed to being listened to before he even opened his mouth. Tall, silver-haired, with the lean build of someone who ran on power more than protein. Victor wore his navy suit like armor. His tie was perfectly knotted. His cufflinks glinted beneath the fluorescent lights. He looked at the cluster of people in front of him, the two officers, the gate agent, the man in the pink polo, and the calm black woman standing silent in the eye of the storm. His eyes briefly paused on Avery, but there was no flicker of recognition. To him, she was just another passenger causing a disruption. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice deep, practiced, and just sharp enough to remind everyone that he expected problems to resolve themselves quickly. Linda practically exhaled with relief. "Mr. Harlan, thank God. We've got a passenger who's refusing to accept a seat reassignment. I followed protocol, but she's holding up the entire flight. Security had to be called." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Protocol," he repeated, scanning the officers. "She was booked for seat 2A. Linda continued, "But the system had a conflict. I reassigned her. She refused to comply." Victor turned to Avery with the confidence of a man who had done this dozens of times. "Smooth a wrinkle. Move the obstacle. Keep the machine running. Ma'am, I understand there's been some confusion. but I assure you we're working to resolve it. Our gate agent has offered you an alternative seat. If you're unwilling to accept that, we will gladly refund your ticket, and you can make arrangements on a later flight." Avery didn't blink. She didn't look at the officers or Linda. She looked straight at Victor, and then she said his name, Victor. The sound of it stopped him cold. There was no anger in her voice, just precision, confidence, familiarity. He tilted his head, the way someone does when they're not quite sure if they've misheard something. "I beg your pardon, I was wondering when you'd come out," Avery said. Her tone hadn't changed. "Though I didn't expect to meet you here. Not like this." Victor's brows knit slightly. There was a flicker in his eyes. Something starting to shift. His brain was scanning, hunting for context, trying to place her. She gave him no help. "I believe we're scheduled to meet tomorrow morning," she added. "Paris, Hôtel de Crillon, 10 He blinked, and then it hit him. Not all at once, but in stages. The voice, the posture, the unshakable presence, and then the name on the manifest. Seat 2A. Victor's face drained of color. He remembered the dossier, the meeting materials prepared by his chief of staff, the firm that was acquiring nearly a third of Solis Air, the key partner from Horizon Equity, the architect of the deal, the woman described as one of the most powerful and disruptive forces in global aviation finance. Avery Miles, the woman he had just offered a refund to. The woman Linda had just tried to bump into a middle seat. The woman who now stood calmly, unshaken, with 2 officers flanking her, and the entire gate area watching. He took a step back. He began, but there was no script for this. Graham Dalton let out a confused grunt. "Wait, what's happening?" Avery finally looked at him, just once, then turned back to Victor. "You said something about resolving the issue. Let's do that now." Victor nodded quickly, as if trying to catch up to the speed of his own shame. "Of course. Immediately. This is a mistake. A massive mistake." He turned on Linda, his tone sharp now, stripped of any pretense. "Her ticket. Give it to me." Linda's face paled. "Mr. Harlan, I didn't know I said give it to me." Linda fumbled at her keyboard, then reached under the counter and retrieved the original boarding pass for seat 2A. Victor snatched it from her hand. His eyes scanned the name he should have memorized last week, the name that now threatened to unravel everything. He held up the boarding pass like it was a lifeline. "Ms. Miles, your seat is ready. Let me personally escort you on board." But Avery didn't move yet. She looked at him, not with vindication, but with the cool, clinical detachment of someone who had seen this moment coming from miles away. "I'm not interested in performance, Victor," she said quietly. "I'm interested in accountability." Victor swallowed hard. "Yes, absolutely. You'll have it." She finally stepped forward. He turned, signaling to the officers with a tight nod. They stepped aside. He turned to Graham next. "And you," Victor said, his voice quieter but no less deadly. "Your comments have been noted. You'll be removed from this flight immediately. Your Solis Air privileges are terminated effective now." What Graham shouted, "You can't do that, I can," Victor said, "and I have." Graham opened his mouth again, but the older officer had already moved to his side. "Sir, let's go." As Graham was escorted away, his expression melted from arrogance to disbelief. He looked around, but no one was on his side anymore. Victor turned to Linda next. "You're done. Get your things. Security will escort you off the premises." She stared at him. "But I followed protocol." "No," Victor said. "You followed your bias. You followed your assumptions. And now you're going to follow security out that door." He turned back to Avery, face drawn. "Please, let me carry your bag." Avery hesitated, then handed it to him. The weight of it seemed to humble him more than any word could. He held it like something sacred. She followed him down the jet bridge, the two of them in an uneasy silence. The flight attendants stared as they entered. Some gasped, others whispered. They had seen Victor storm off minutes ago. Now he returned, carrying a passenger's bag, his posture bent just slightly in penance. Avery walked behind him with her chin high. Victor stopped at seat 2A. A man, already seated there, blinked up in surprise. Victor didn't ask. He simply said, "You've been reassigned to 18C. Please move now." The man muttered something, stood, and slinked away. Victor placed Avery's bag carefully in the overhead bin. Then he turned to her. "Can I bring you anything champagne, food, Wi-Fi code?" "I'll be fine," Avery said. She sat down. He lingered a moment longer, then nodded. "I'll see you in Paris." She looked up at him. "Yes, you will." And then she opened her laptop and went back to work. The cabin hummed to life. The doors closed, and Solis Air Flight 802 taxied away, carrying with it a woman who had just reminded an entire company that dignity was not a seat assignment. It was a standard. The plane ascended smoothly into a slate-gray sky streaked with pale orange. New York shrank below them in glints of glass and shadow. Inside the cabin, everything was calm. Champagne flutes clinked, seatbelts clicked, and the air carried that warm scent of altitude and citrus. But Avery Miles was not calm. She sat in seat 2A, upright, her laptop open but untouched. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, unmoving. She stared at the screen as if the words on it no longer mattered, because for the moment, they didn't. What mattered was the replay. The moment she was told to move to 26B. The way Linda's eyes narrowed like a dare. The way Graham's voice slithered through the crowd like a whispered attack. The way no one stopped it until the hierarchy was reversed. Avery breathed slowly through her nose, grounding herself. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even sadness. It was that old feeling, tiredness. The kind that settled into your bones when you knew your dignity had been made a question instead of a constant. Again. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather notebook, the same one she had used since her second year in business. Inside were pages of mergers, strategy diagrams, meeting sketches, and tucked in the back notes her grandmother used to write her in curled, looping script. You do not rise to prove them wrong, baby. You rise to prove yourself right. Avery smiled faintly. Then she turned the page. Behind the first-class curtain, Victor Harlan sat hunched in the forward galley, a space usually reserved for flight attendants and quiet preparation. He was no longer the man who had strutted onto the jet bridge 20 minutes earlier. He was folded in on himself, coat removed, tie slightly loosened, a glass of untouched sparkling water on the counter beside him. He stared blankly at the overhead compartments. She knew my name. She called me Victor. His thoughts circled like turbulence. He could still hear her voice, low and calm, speaking his name as if it belonged to her, as if she already held the keys to his fate. Because she did. Avery Miles was not just a partner in the upcoming deal. She was the architect of it, the force behind Horizon Equity's aggressive push into aviation infrastructure, the woman who held 27% of his company's future in the palm of her hand, and he had told her to accept a refund. Victor's fingers curled slightly, his jaw clenched, not out of anger at her, but at himself. He had made a fatal mistake. He had seen a problem where he should have seen a partner. The whispers had already started among the flight attendants. They did not speak to him directly, but he could feel it. The energy had shifted. No longer reverence, only curiosity, discomfort. Some version of gossip was already blooming. He deserved it. He looked up and caught a glimpse of the aisle. Avery was still there, still regal, still working, or at least appearing to. He could not see her expression from here, and perhaps that was mercy. He was not sure he could survive the weight of her eyes again. One of the flight attendants approached. "Mr. Harlan," she said quietly. "Are you all right?" Victor nodded too quickly. "Fine. Thank you." She paused. "She asked for water earlier. Just water. Nothing else." Victor looked up. She didn't want champagne. The attendant shook her head. "No, sir. Just still water." She said she had work to do. Victor nodded, swallowing. He stood up abruptly. "I'll bring it to her." The attendant hesitated. "Sir, I'll bring it." He took the bottle and a chilled glass and made his way down the aisle, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached 2A, he paused. Avery did not look up. "I brought you water," he said quietly. She raised her eyes to meet his. "Thank you." He placed it on the tray table, his hands careful, almost reverent. I'm sorry," he said. She nodded once. "I know." He lingered. She did not invite him to stay. After a moment, he turned and walked away, returning to the galley like a man retreating from a battlefield. In her seat, Avery took the glass and held it, letting the cool condensation kiss her fingers. She didn't drink it right away. She stared at it, thinking not about hydration but about restraint. She had not embarrassed him. She had not raised her voice. She had not needed to. And yet, the message had been unmistakable. Still, her mind was not at ease. Not fully. Because underneath all the grace and all the control, there was something else stirring. A whisper of self-doubt she hated to acknowledge. Should I have spoken louder? Should I have demanded more? Would a white man have simply taken that seat and dared them to remove him? She didn't have the luxury of defiance. She had learned that early. Defiance was a trap. They expected you to react so they could justify what they had already decided about you. So instead, she had become the quiet storm, the one they never saw coming until the sky cracked open. But it cost her, every time. The silence, the grace, the patience, they all took something. Her phone buzzed in her bag, a message from her general counsel. "We've logged the incident. No footage leaked. Yet. Want us to file anything?" Avery stared at the screen, then typed. "Not yet. Let's see what he does tomorrow." She slid the phone away and looked back out the window. The sky was darker now, the sun behind them. The lights of the plane cast a soft glow over the cabin. A young flight attendant with dark skin and a short, curly afro paused beside her. "Excuse me, Ms. Miles," she said gently. Avery turned. "I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled that. I saw it, and it meant a lot." Avery's expression softened. "Thank you," she replied, her voice warmer. The young woman smiled, nodded, and moved down the aisle. That moment did more to settle Avery's spirit than Victor's apology ever could. She wasn't alone in this. She never had been. But too often, people like her had to win battles in silence so others could someday live in peace. She looked down at the water, finally lifted it, and took a sip. It was cold, clean, bracing. Exactly what she needed to finish the rest of the flight. She closed her notebook, reopened her laptop, and pulled up the revised board materials. Tomorrow's meeting in Paris would not just be about integration. It would be about interrogation. And Victor Harlan had no idea just how much the agenda had changed. The glow of the seatbelt sign dimmed as the aircraft leveled into its cruising altitude. A familiar hush fell over the cabin, the kind of silence that invited reflection but offered no comfort. Passengers began to settle into their individual rhythms. Some opened laptops, some accepted their second glasses of wine. Others closed their eyes and disappeared into the dark cocoon of sleep. But not Avery. She remained upright in the seat 2A, her posture pristine, her mind refusing to disengage. The internal hum of the engines did little to drown out the weight pressing in on her. She tried to focus on the document open on her screen, a predictive revenue model for Solis Air's European expansion, but the numbers blurred at the edges. Her thoughts circled back to the gate, to the moment she had to name her own worth aloud, to the stunned silence that followed, to the way Victor Harlan had crumpled inward when he finally realized who she was. The man who had spent the last 6 months dodging Horizon Equity's integration requests. The man who had treated the merger like a formality instead of a reckoning. The man who had just made the most public mistake of his professional life. And now he was somewhere on this aircraft, out of sight, out of power. It was not victory Avery felt. It was something quieter, heavier. She closed her laptop and reached for the armrest. Her fingers found the stitched leather and traced the seam absent-mindedly. For a long moment, she just breathed, letting the cabin's hush wash over her. In the forward galley, Victor Harlan leaned with one shoulder against the wall, head bowed, jaw tight. He had once believed that shame was a private experience, a thing you could feel, swallow, and file away behind a forced smile. But this was different. This wasn't quiet. It was loud and echoing. It had the shape of people's eyes avoiding his. The shape of flight attendants offering Avery warmer service than he had ever received himself. The shape of truth mirrored back at him with nowhere to run. He had thought he was insulated. His title, his record, his money, all of it had given him the illusion that he could glide above the human cost of his decisions. But now he understood. Titles didn't mean insulation. They meant responsibility. He had failed. Not just Avery, not just his company. He had failed the very culture he was supposed to lead. The worst part wasn't the mistake. It was how easily he had made it. He hadn't questioned Linda's actions, hadn't even looked at the boarding pass. He had seen Avery Miles, standing still, surrounded by security, and he had assumed she was the problem. He had seen what he was trained to see, and it had nearly destroyed him. The curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane fluttered as a flight attendant passed through. Victor straightened, smoothing his tie, then stopped himself. What was the point? Polish meant nothing when the surface had already cracked. He glanced down the aisle toward seat 2A. She was sitting with perfect composure, head tilted toward the window now. Her profile was illuminated by the overhead light. She looked like something carved from stillness. He remembered the first time her name had crossed his desk. It had come in a thick packet. Horizon Equity's lead negotiator for the Solis acquisition, Avery Miles, graduate of Spelman, Wharton MBA, founder of one of the most successful black-owned private equity firms in the country. Her profile had been impossible to ignore, but he had done exactly that. Not out of malice, out of arrogance. He had assumed he would meet her eventually, over drinks, in a room where he controlled the temperature. Instead, he had met her at a gate, and she had brought the weather with her. Back in seat 2A. Avery's eyes were closed now, but she wasn't asleep. Her thoughts drifted through memory. She remembered her first flight as a child. Her mother had packed sandwiches wrapped in foil. They had sat in coach in a row of 3. The flight attendant had offered her apple juice and smiled kindly. That flight had felt like magic, like possibility. She hadn't felt that way on a plane in years. Flying had become another stage, another place where she had to perform dignity to be allowed to keep it. Still, she had never once taken her seat for granted. Every first-class boarding pass she had ever held had been earned with more effort than her peers would ever understand. Every conference room she had walked into had required a mental map of how not to be seen as a threat, and still, here she was, relegated, resisted, and finally recognized. But what mattered more was what would come next, because tomorrow she wouldn't just walk into that Paris boardroom as an investor. She would walk in as a mirror, and they would have to look. Her phone buzzed quietly in her lap, a message from Horizon's Paris office. Boardroom confirmed. Translation headsets in place. All press requests denied as instructed. She typed back, "Good. Prep full audit summary. I want real numbers." She placed the phone face down and took a slow sip of water. A few rows behind her, a flight attendant offered Victor a seat in the crew jump seat. He declined politely. He remained standing, watching the clouds through the galley window, alone with the truth. He thought about the phrase she had used. "I'm not interested in performance. I'm interested in accountability." He turned the words over in his mind like prayer beads. Accountability. It was a word they tossed around in annual reports, in keynotes and vision decks, but this was what it looked like. Standing in a galley with no seat of your own, carrying a bag for the woman who now held your legacy in her hands. Watching the company you built shift on its axis because of one moment where your instincts failed you. He wasn't afraid of losing his job. He was afraid of finally understanding why he might deserve to. He had always prided himself on being a builder, but perhaps his greatest legacy would be in helping build something new. Not from the top, but from the foundation he had ignored for too long. He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out his notebook. No titles, no PR spin, just a blank page. At the top, he wrote in small block letters, "Rebuilding Trust," and underneath it, the name he now understood better than his own. Avery Miles. Morning light spilled over the rooftops of Paris, cool and silvery, glancing off the Seine as the city stirred to life, just beyond the river, in a penthouse suite at Hôtel de Crillon. Avery Miles stood by a window framed with ivory curtains, watching a city she had learned to love. Below, Paris moved with its usual elegant rhythm, early cafes opening, delivery vans humming, a cyclist weaving through narrow cobbled streets. The world did not know what had happened aboard Solis Air Flight 802, but the world would soon know what came next. Avery turned from the window and walked back toward the grand oak table in the suite study, where her team had been assembling materials for the board presentation. Several manila folders were stacked in precise rows. Her laptop was open, displaying Horizon Equity's internal culture audit of Solis Air, a report so thorough it made no room for denial. She flipped through it again. Pages of interviews, employee surveys, HR complaint logs, incident data, all pointing to one conclusion. The gate agent incident wasn't a fluke. It was a symptom. Avery tapped the edge of the report, her mind sharpening. They would expect a financial update. She would give them a moral reckoning. Her assistant, Malik, entered the suite with a soft knock and an earpiece in hand. Translation headsets confirmed for the room. He said, "No press outside. The boardroom's secure. They're waiting." Avery nodded. "Victor," she asked. "He arrived 20 minutes ago. Didn't say much. He looks small." Avery said nothing for a moment. She closed the folder, took a deep breath, and rose. "Good," she said. She moved with measured purpose as they exited the suite and descended the marble staircase. Her heels made almost no sound on the carpet, but everyone noticed her. Staff parted instinctively as she passed. There was something about her presence calm but weighty. She didn't need to declare authority. It followed her. Inside the boardroom on the top floor, 12 men sat around a gleaming glass table. They were mostly older, mostly white, mostly shaped by the same ideas that had built legacy institutions like Solis Air. They wore tailored suits, Rolexes, and the expressions of men who expected to control the pace of any conversation they entered. Until Avery walked in, they rose quickly, automatically. Some forced smiles, others looked uncertain. Victor Harlan stood at the far end, not at the head of the table where he usually sat, but one seat down. He wore a darker suit today, conservative, almost penitential. His face was pale, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. "Good morning," Avery said, offering a composed nod to the room. She placed her folder down, opened her laptop, and looked around. "Shall we begin?" There were polite murmurs, a few clearing throats. No one dared interrupt her. She started with the numbers: projected growth, brand equity, fuel costs, route consolidation. She spoke the language fluently, without pause. Every line she presented was clean, sharp, supported by data. The board members relaxed slightly. This was familiar terrain. They began to nod, scribble notes, engage. Then her voice changed. It cooled, just slightly. "But none of this matters," she said, folding her hands in front of her. "If the foundation of the company is compromised." The room tensed. Numbers are clean, but culture is bleeding. She tapped her laptop, and the screen behind her came alive with graphs. Complaint volumes by airport, termination trends by demographic, exit interview keywords like disrespect, dismissed, ignored, glowing in red. "Yesterday," she continued, "I experienced firsthand what your passengers and staff have been quietly suffering for years. Now they were fully still. I was denied my seat by a gate agent who saw my skin before she saw my ticket. I was questioned, redirected, and eventually threatened with security, all for asserting a right I had already paid for. I was not offered a solution. I was offered shame." Victor looked down. Avery's voice did not rise. It did not falter, but it pierced. "Let me be clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a system functioning exactly as it was designed to without accountability." The presentation now displayed a timeline of misconduct incidents at various international hubs: Heathrow, JFK, Charles de Gaulle. Gate agents were often the final line of experience for customers, and too often, they treated people like obstacles to efficiency, not individuals deserving dignity. She let the word sit in the air. Dignity. It hovered like a verdict. She turned to Victor, finally addressing him directly. And when your CEO arrived, his first instinct was not to investigate. It was to side with the assumption that the black woman in first class must have done something wrong. Victor met her gaze and did not look away. "I failed," he said simply. The words were quiet, but their impact echoed. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I failed to see clearly. I failed to lead. I'm deeply sorry, Ms. Miles, and I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences come from that failure." Avery nodded slowly. She appreciated the ownership, but one apology did not fix an institution. "That failure is not yours alone," she said. "It is systemic, woven into procedures, unchecked assumptions, and the belief that customer experience is secondary to bottom-line efficiency." She clicked to the final slide. It showed a new structure, not of finance, but of values. "I'm proposing a full audit of Solis Air's operational culture, a third-party assessment, fully transparent. Every department, every route, every touch point." There were murmurs around the table. She raised her hand gently. "In addition, I am initiating the Passenger Dignity Initiative. Every employee, from pilots to baggage handlers to executives in this room, will undergo a new training framework. Not a webinar, not a checkbox. A real, ongoing curriculum." She looked directly at Victor again. "And you, Mr. Harlan, will be in the front row of the first session." Victor nodded. "Of course." The room remained silent. It was not just the audacity of the plan. It was the clarity of her power. She had not raised her voice. She had not sought revenge. She had simply rewritten the terms of their future, and they knew they needed her to lead it. Avery closed her laptop. "Let's build something that actually earns the loyalty of the people we serve. Let's make dignity the policy, not the exception." There was a pause. Then, slowly, one board member began to clap, then another, and another, until the room was filled with the sound of applause, not just for a presentation, but for a shift, a reset, a new altitude. Avery remained composed, but inside, something moved, not pride, resolve. This was not the end of the work. It was only the beginning. The next morning, headlines didn't scream Avery's name. No leaked footage, no social media uproar, no hashtags. But inside the aviation industry, word traveled like wind through the fuselage of a wide-body jet. Discreet murmurs among boardrooms, whispers across airport lounges, long glances between executives who had heard the story behind closed doors. Something had shifted. Avery Miles had drawn a line in the sand and made the CEO of Solis Air stand behind it. Back in New York, at Solis headquarters, the fallout was already unfolding. The company's head of legal received a 2-hour video debrief from Avery's team. HR was instructed to begin the immediate review of past complaints. A third-party consulting firm was quietly onboarded to begin the culture audit. None of it had been announced publicly, but it didn't need to be. Inside the company, the silence was louder than any press release. Linda Brewster, the former gate agent from JFK, sat in the back seat of a lift outside Terminal 8, holding a sealed cardboard box with her personal belongings. She hadn't spoken to anyone from the company since that morning she was walked out. Her airport badge had been deactivated before she even reached the employee lot. All she had now was time and regret. She still didn't understand exactly what had happened. One minute she was following policy. The next, she was being called into the office and handed a termination letter she hadn't even read. She didn't know who Avery was until someone forwarded her a Reddit thread titled "CEO Gets Schooled by the Woman Who Owns His Future." It had 1 million views. Linda hadn't watched the video. She didn't need to. She had been there. She had watched Avery stand firm, calm, with no raised voice, no swearing, no threats. And yet the damage Linda had done in those 5 minutes assuming Avery didn't belong in seat 2A had detonated across the company like an untraceable bomb. She leaned her head against the window, eyes glassy. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing passengers as people. She hadn't meant to, but after 15 years, it had become easier to default to judgment than patience. Efficiency over empathy, policy over people. That morning, she had told herself she was just enforcing a seat change. But deep down, she knew what it really was: control, and now it was gone. Back at Solis HQ. Victor Harlan sat at the edge of a long conference table surrounded by his executive team. His posture was straighter than usual, his tone more subdued, his words more carefully chosen. "We're going to fix this," he said. "Not in press releases, not in slogans, in action. Starting now." There were nods, but not the kind that came easily. These were nods of reckoning. Everyone in the room had heard about the board meeting in Paris. Some had already reviewed the new training mandates. Others had received emails notifying them of upcoming internal evaluations. Victor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the tarmac. "I lost my perspective," he said, "and I will not lose this company." Behind him, the room remained quiet. Later that day, in a small cafe on the Lower East Side, Graham Dalton scrolled through his phone, searching job listings. His inbox was a graveyard of silence. His LinkedIn messages had dried up. He had been let go from his sales job less than 48 hours after his face appeared on the internet, captured in perfect clarity, mid-eye roll at a black woman asserting her right to her seat. He hadn't even known she was a CEO. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He hadn't cared to know. Now, he was on a list no airline would touch. He had been told by HR that his presence in any client-facing role was now a reputational risk. He'd tried to argue, but the clip him saying, "Just take the seat," "lady" had been stitched into a viral TikTok montage. His moment of smugness had become his brand. He had become a meme, and it wouldn't fade quickly. He ordered a coffee, sat down with his laptop, and opened yet another application form. There was a knock at his ego he couldn't shake, that maybe what happened on that plane wasn't just unfortunate timing, maybe it was exposure. He had always seen himself as sharp, articulate, assertive, but now he wondered if all along he had simply been loud and entitled at Horizon Equity's Midtown office. Avery sat in a glass-walled conference room, a team of analysts presenting projected benefits of the culture audit. She listened carefully, eyes sharp but expression neutral. She was tired, though she didn't show it. The events of the past 48 hours had taxed her in ways no negotiation ever had. It wasn't the confrontation itself, it was the constant pressure of having to be composed through it, having to respond with strategy instead of emotion. That pressure wasn't new. It was her native language, but it wore you down all the same. Her assistant, Malik, entered quietly and placed a folder on the table. "The Paris debrief," he said, "and something personal. It's from Victor." Avery didn't flinch. She waited until the room cleared, then opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten. "Avery, I won't ask for forgiveness. That's not something I've earned. What I will ask is that you hold me accountable, publicly, privately, wherever necessary. I didn't just mishandle a situation. I confirmed the worst expectations about leadership. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't make a scene. You held up a mirror, and I finally saw what I had become. Thank you for not turning away. I intend to earn your respect the way you've already earned mine. Victor." She folded the letter slowly. No theatrics, no flattery, just words, real ones, for the first time. Avery let herself exhale. The war wasn't over, but perhaps one soldier had laid down his pride. That evening, she walked along the East River, phone in hand, reviewing updates on the Passenger Dignity Initiative. The curriculum was in early development. Consultants had already been briefed, and a new internal review panel would soon be formed, made up of frontline staff from across the company. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was a promise. She looked up at the sky, where a Solis Air jet curved overhead, its engines humming gently into dusk, and she smiled, not because she had won, but because something had finally begun. 6 months passed like weather, quiet, unrelenting, shaping everything. From the outside, Solis Air was still the same airline sleek planes, crisp branding, smiling crew, but on the inside, something deeper was shifting. The culture was undergoing its first true metamorphosis in decades. There were new trainings, new policies, new reporting channels, but none of it mattered without new behavior. And slowly, that too began to change. It didn't happen because of press pressure. There hadn't been any viral campaign. The public never even knew the full story. That was intentional. Avery hadn't wanted this to be spectacle. She had wanted it to be structure. And so it had begun, quietly but thoroughly, from the top down. At JFK Terminal 8, in the same place where everything had unraveled, a new kind of atmosphere was taking hold. Not perfection, not yet, but awareness. One morning, a young gate agent named Zoe Franklin helped an elderly Japanese couple who had missed their connection. They didn't speak English. The husband seemed disoriented, his wife clutching his hand tightly, in her office later that day. Avery reviewed a report showing customer satisfaction scores had jumped 18% across all international routes. Complaint filings were down. Internal promotion rates among underrepresented employees had doubled. Exit interviews had shifted from bitterness to gratitude. She should have felt pride, but she felt something deeper: responsibility. This wasn't about headlines. It was about lives. It was about making sure that what happened to her, what nearly happened to others, would become so rare that people would struggle to believe it ever occurred. And the only way to make that happen was to stay in the seat, to keep flying the long flight home. That weekend, Avery boarded a Solis Air flight from Paris back to New York. The same route, same cabin, same seat, 2A. But this time, the atmosphere was different. She noticed it immediately. The crew was diverse, not just in appearance but in energy. They moved with attentiveness that didn't feel performative. It felt grounded, confident. She was greeted by a young black flight attendant with natural curls tucked neatly under her cap. Her name tag read Simone. "Ms. Miles," she said warmly, "welcome aboard. We're honored to have you with us. Would you care for a glass of champagne before takeoff?" Avery paused for half a second. Not because she didn't want it, because she hadn't heard those exact words before, not spoken like that, not to her. She smiled gently. "I'd love one." "Thank you, Simone." As the woman walked away, Avery turned toward the window. Outside, the tarmac buzzed with its usual rhythm, but for once, she didn't feel like she had to armor up. She didn't feel like she had to prove anything. She just felt seated, seen, home. The champagne arrived moments later, bubbles catching the cabin light like tiny stars. She raised the glass quietly to herself. Not a toast of victory, a toast to continuation, to the work still ahead. As the aircraft lifted off, rising steadily into a twilight sky, Avery opened her notebook, not the leather one, a new one. The first page was blank. She wrote a single sentence. "Dignity doesn't scale through rules. It scales through remembrance." She closed the cover, exhaled, and let the sky carry her forward. The wheels touched down at JFK just past midnight, but the city never truly slept, and neither did Avery's thoughts. She waited patiently as the plane taxied to the gate, her body still but her mind already organizing the next steps. She hadn't checked her messages yet. She needed the quiet, the clarity of descent, the way returning to home soil always made her reevaluate everything she had just carried across an ocean. As the seatbelt sign blinked off, Simone returned to her with the same poise she'd shown at boarding. "It was a pleasure flying with you, Ms. Miles," she said. Avery nodded with genuine warmth. The pleasure was mine. The words were small, but something in the exchange felt quietly generational. Like Simone knew she wasn't just serving a customer, she was continuing something. Outside the gate, Malik was already waiting with her coat in a car, standing tall in a navy wool overcoat. He looked relieved when he saw her. "Good flight?" he asked. "Better than good," she said softly. It felt different this time. He smiled. "You changed the air, ma'am." She didn't reply, but the words followed her as she stepped into the sleek black sedan, the Manhattan skyline blinking faintly in the distance. The driver pulled onto the expressway, and the city wrapped around them like a constellation in motion. Back at her penthouse, the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the East River. Avery didn't turn on any lights. She walked straight to the glass and stared into the city. She took her shoes off quietly, set down her laptop bag, and just breathed.